our Maundy, Thursday Agape Feast that's coming up, because it's kind of like something that I've been working on along with the worship committee. So for those of you who didn't see the article in the newsletter or saw it and maybe wanted to know more, Agape Feasts are something that were practiced by early Christians. So worship services weren't necessarily separate from the Eucharist. It was a time for them to come together and fellowship and sing and have a word and then break bread and remember Jesus' sacrifice together. And I think that it is a really great way for us to kind of rediscover our early Christian roots, especially coming off of our Bible study earlier this year on Christian history, where did we come from? And I think it'll be a really nice time for us to come together. It'll be different than anything that you guys have done for Maundy, Thursday before. It's going to be a time of fellowship and reflection. We'll eat, we'll sing, and I think it'll be really nice. So, so that's just a little more about the Agape Feast that we have coming up. I just kind of wanted to, since I was in the pulpit, I just wanted to take this moment to tell you about it. God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable to you, O Lord, our rock and our redeemer. I love a good story. I know that today's scripture passage was long, but it's a good story. I love stories in all forms. I enjoy reading books and comic books. I like watching movies or television shows or even hearing them. When I was a kid, my dad was the best at telling stories to me and my sister at night. As the main characters in his stories, we went on countless adventures through time and space. I love a good story. It's probably what hooked me on the TV show How I Met Your Mother, which ended this week. Even if you don't watch the show, I bet you saw an article on Facebook or on some online news article. I even saw an article in the print edition of the Tribune this week. It was pretty big news. The reason being, because the fans of the show are really deeply divided by how it ended. Hemyam, as it is affectionately called, began 9 years ago with the main character Ted sitting down his children, his teenage children, and telling them the incredible story of how he met their mother. Ted shares stories of his adventures with his friends, his career struggles and successes, his relationships and his heartbreaks, all a part of his quest to meet the one. He finally finished telling his story in the very last episode last Monday. And like I said, a lot of fans were upset. And I'm not going to tell you the end of the story, just in case you haven't seen it yet and want to be surprised. But a lot of fans were upset because the thing is, stories don't always end the way we expect them to, or think that they should. We see this in our favorite books and movies, and we see it in our own lives. Ultimately, fans of Hemyam are upset because the story didn't end the way they thought it should. Ted met the one and had his happy ending that he always wanted. But nothing lasts forever, and the end of the story reflected that. Life doesn't always turn out the way we expect it to. We see that in today's gospel story. Lazarus, Mary, and Martha are good friends of Jesus. We are told that Mary is the one who anointed Jesus with oil and dried his feet with her hair, something which actually doesn't happen until the next chapter in this gospel, but the original audience was likely as familiar with this as we are. Lazarus is very ill, and his sisters send word to Jesus. Jesus is nearby, but he delays his visit a couple of days. By the time he arrives in Bethany, Lazarus has already died, and Lazarus' family and friends are distraught with grief. We even see Jesus cry for Lazarus. Martha says to Jesus that if he had been there, her brother wouldn't have died. Later, others who were mourning similarly asked, could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying? And they kind of have a point. For those who have been with Jesus as he healed others who were sick, it seemed crazy that he was not able to heal a close friend in his own time of need. Instead, Jesus was too late, and Lazarus died. He was buried according to the Jewish custom and sealed in the tomb. And it seems like the end of the story. A few weeks ago, we talked about Nicodemus and his limited understanding of what was possible. Here too, Mary and Martha, the disciples and the others that are grieving, seem very limited in what they believe is possible. In the Gospels, we'd seen Jesus perform other amazing miracles, but just like the disciples and the others gathered, it seemed like there wasn't any hope after Lazarus' death. There are just some things that can't be fixed. I honestly think that the Lazarus narrative, the story, is one of the most relatable stories in the Gospels, because we've all experienced our own death, loss, pain, grief, depression in our own lives. Whether it was the loss of an actual person, or the loss of a job, or the important relationship, or stability in your own life, we've all been where Mary and Martha are. Distraught and upset at the loss, Martha says to Jesus, "If you had been here, my brother would not have died." We too often are where God is in the face of our own loss. When I was 9 years old, two very important things happened in my life within a very brief time. First, after much contemplation and questioning of my pastor and others in my congregation, I made my confession of faith in Jesus, and I was baptized on Easter Sunday. It was actually, the anniversary was on Friday, April 4th. I had that new Christian glow, a childlike faith, and a desire to continue to engage my faith deeper. About a month and a half later, my Aunt Lena suddenly died at the age of 35 from a blood clot. I was devastated. My whole family was. I was left with lots of questions, but one of the biggest was, why did God let this happen? Someone who was my dad's sister, my mom's best friend, someone who was so young, who left behind a young son. It wasn't just my first real personal experience with death, it was perhaps the first time I realized that we can't escape death and sorrow in our own lives. My Aunt Lena's death was the end of a beautiful story from my childhood, of family camping trips and day trips to cheese festivals and craft fairs. Even at 9, I knew everything would be different, and it was. My family was broken. My grandparents, aunt and uncle, cousins, and my own immediate family were devastated by the loss. Family get-togethers became less frequent. Holidays became more challenging. My aunt's son, Josh, went to live with his dad, and he was absent from most family functions in the years that followed his mom's death. Everyone learned to deal with their loss in their own ways, both positive and negative. My immediate family ended up moving to Texas as a way to have a fresh start and a new life together. After almost 10 years, I had become accustomed to life without my Aunt Lena. Her absence was still felt by all, but I understood that that story was over and my life had continued on. But then, one day, we got the call from my cousin Josh that he and his fiancée were expecting a baby. Somehow, this rush of energy and new life was surged through our extended family. It was tinged with grief of the memories of my aunt, to be sure, but we all had something to look forward to together. When Lena Cheyenne was born 5 years ago, I realized that the story was never really over. No one could have predicted that the ending would come in the form of a tiny little baby who carried the name of my aunt, who brought such hope and healing to our family. I remember holding her in my arms when she was just a few days old, amazed, thinking she had no way to comprehend what a miracle she was for our family. Jesus tells Martha, "I am the resurrection and the life." Martha laments that Jesus had not arrived in time to save her brother, but he reminds her that through him, renewed life is possible even in the face of death. Those who believe in me, even though they die, will live, and everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. As I was preparing today's sermon, I was struck by a comment that I read which suggested that Christians only talk about this idea of death and the resurrection at funerals and on Easter. I think this might be a fair assessment. And it's interesting because much of our theology hinges on the idea that Jesus died and rose again. We encounter loss in our lives, loss that seems so devastating that we believe that it's the end of the story. We forget that resurrection is possible every day, that Jesus made it possible. Before Lazarus had even died, Jesus tries to tell his disciples that there is more to this story than meets the eye. This illness does not lead to death. Rather, it is for God's glory, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it. This is a powerful prediction of what is to come, because although Martha and Mary and the others believed that Jesus could have healed Lazarus if he had just gotten there in time, once Lazarus has died, it seems to us that there's nothing more that can be done. And this is a radical concept for us to grasp too. When my Aunt Lena died, as much as I prayed and hoped that she would come back, I honestly don't know if I believed it would happen. There are some things that happen in our life, like death, which seem like they automatically end the story. What can be said, what more can be said or done after that? When Jesus tells Martha that her brother will rise again, she says that she understands that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day. When we grapple with death, we affirm that understanding too. This idea that resurrection is in some distant time and place, not something that is occurring every day in our lives, in the here and now. Not I was or I will be, but I am. I am the resurrection and the life. Jesus makes resurrection possible in our own lives now. One of the other lectionary passages for today came from Ezekiel about the dry bones, which came to life as Ezekiel prophesied to them. And I had the opportunity to hear one of my classmates preach on that scripture last night. She suggested that together with God, we can breathe new life into the dry bones in our own lives and in our community, just as Ezekiel offered God's promise that out of the Jews scattered throughout the Babylonian Empire, he would restore the people of Israel and make them whole again. I think the dry bones are perhaps what we have become in the face of our own losses and devastation. When Jesus says that I am the resurrection and the life, he is promising that we will find new life through him. We will find resurrection through him. Just as he calls Lazarus to arise from his grave, he too calls us to arise from the depths of despair and grief and confusion where we dwell. He calls us by name, here and now, and offers us new life in the midst of death, in the midst of dry bones. But I think it's important to remember that we have a choice in this. We always have a choice to believe and accept the resurrection, to answer it when he calls our name. When my cousin's daughter, Lena Cheyenne, was born, I and the rest of my family could have still been devastated with the reminder that she will never get to meet her grandma. Her birth could have been a further reminder of our own loss and brokenness. But together we made a choice to accept the new life, to allow our family to be resurrected in the hope of her birth, of the possibilities for new life. We realized that my aunt's death wasn't the end of the story, and we found a new beginning together. Sometimes this can be challenging and difficult for us to see and hear. It's my hope that as new life starts to burst forth this spring, as we see tangible results all around us of new life coming from the death that was left behind by the snow,